A sign and trade for Jonathan Kuminga is a very Joe Dumars kind of move. I'll tell you multiple ways the Pelicans could get a very tricky deal done, but does Kuminga actually fit? It's Locked On Pelicans. Let's go.
You are Locked On Pelicans, your daily New Orleans Pelicans podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to another edition of Locked On Pelicans, the daily podcast covering your favorite team, the New Orleans Pelicans and NBA, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day, available wherever you get your podcasts and available on YouTube. I'm your host, Pelicans Insider, credential member of the media, Jake Madison, at NOLA Jake on Twitter, here with you on this Thursday. And this show almost entirely is going to be about Jonathan Kuminga. We'll get into some coaching stuff a little bit later in the show here, but we're going to dive into how the Pelicans could trade for Jonathan Kuminga because it's really, really tricky. And then, does he even make sense? Does he fit? Why would the team do this? And I'll tell you why it's a very Joe Dumars kind of move that actually I think could be a good thing. We'll talk a little Herb Jones in this as well. Then we'll get into the coaching rumors around associate head coach James Borrego. Today's episode of Locked On Pelicans is brought to you by Monarch Money. Take control of your finances with Monarch Money. Use code LOCKEDONNBA at monarchmoney.com for 50% off your first year. And of course, thank you for making Locked On Pelicans your first listen today and every day. We are here Monday through Friday, the #1 Pelicans podcast covering everything you want to know about this Pelicans team. So please subscribe wherever you get your podcasts and join over 11,000 Pelicans fans on YouTube as well. Become an everydayer. That means you listen Monday through Friday to the Locked On Pelicans podcast. And don't forget, you can watch us on the Gulf Coast Sports and Entertainment Network on your TV every weekday at 10:30 a.m. Let's get into this one. There's a lot of rumors out there right now linking the Pelicans with Golden State Warriors wing power forward Jonathan Kuminga in a sign and trade. We're going to break down how that deal could happen, whether it'd be smart anyway, and then we'll talk the coaching stuff here. This, I think I've seen it's reported by Mark Stein and Jake Fisher, two people I absolutely trust. I believe it's been mentioned in The Athletic and other places as well. Now, I do wonder, just on the first part of this, are those links coming from the Warriors? Or are they coming from the Pelicans? Probably feel more about the Warriors. The Pelicans this cycle have really not been leaking almost anything. So keep that in mind here. But a sign and trade for Jonathan Kuminga is exceptionally tricky. Sign and trades are a little bit tricky anyway. For someone who's going to get the raise that Jonathan Kuminga is going to, more than 20% of his previous salary, which was about a little over $7 million, between $7 and $8 million this past year, it gets even harder. So before we even get into whether Kuminga fits and all that, what's a trade got to look like? We are going to do a deep dive on some collective bargaining agreement things here. And I want you to get familiar with the phrase base year compensation. When a player is getting a raise of more than, I think, 20% from what their previous salary is in a sign and trade, base year compensation, sing it with me, comes into play. And basically what that means, for NBA trades, when two teams are over the salary cap, salaries more or less need to match or get within the range of matching to keep it simple. So if you're trading for a $30 million player, you needed to send out about $30 million, usually within plus minus 20% of that. In base year compensation, the outgoing amount for the team that's signing and trading someone, so in this case, it would be the Golden State Warriors, it's 50% of the new salary or last year's salary, right? Whichever is greater. So in this case, it's likely going to be 50% of the new salary. So let's say Jonathan Kuminga is being signed and traded to the New Orleans Pelicans on a 4-year, $100 million deal. And let's just say it's flat, $25 million a year, which I think is somewhat of a reasonable number for him. The outgoing salary for the Warriors is $12.5 million, whereas the outgoing salary for the Pelicans is $25 million. There's a gulf there. That's not easy to do, is it? That's kind of difficult. So with the 20%, the Pelicans need to send out at least $20 million, while the Warriors can only take back $15 million. That makes it complicated to say the least, right? Because now the salaries don't actually match when normally they need to match. And this is even complicated more so, and we'll touch on this in a second, by the fact that the Pelicans definitely want to stay under the luxury tax. We're doing a whole lot of cap gymnastics here. So if the Pelicans need to send out $20 million. The Warriors can only take back $15 million, right? Like, you couldn't include DeJounte Murray in this sort of thing. Not that they would anyway, but you get what I'm trying to say there. So here's a way that you could do this sort of trade. It could be structured, and we're not getting into the merits of the players yet. I just want to use this for example purposes, right? It could be structured where you trade Herb Jones to the Warriors. That's $14 million. The Warriors can only take back 15, so that's in those parameters. And then move Saddiq Bey to a third team. He makes a little over $6 million this year. That puts it above that $20 million minimum that the Pelicans need to send out. You need to find a third team. Draft picks and draft compensation likely need to be involved in that, but that's a way that you could get it done. And that's on Kuminga making $25 a year. Maybe because there's not a huge market for Kuminga because there's not a ton of cap space out there, it's a sign and trade for $20 million. This would, let's call it a 3-year, $60 million deal. There's a few things that I'll get into the specifics with that in a second here. $20 million a year. That becomes $10 million outgoing for the Golden State Warriors, $20 million outgoing for the Pelicans. If you do the plus 20% minus 20% here, that's $12 million outgoing for the Golden State Warriors and $16 outgoing for the New Orleans Pelicans. That would still be Herb Jones basically making $14 million per year, slightly under that, going to the Warriors. And that would be, well, actually that creates kind of a bit more of a problem, right? Because the Golden State Warriors can only take back $12 million. So how do you make this work all of a sudden? Whereas the Pelicans need to send out 16. You know, that's Herb Jones and Antonio Reeves in some capacity with this, right? You see how that gets really complicated all of a sudden with what the Warriors can take back versus what the Pelicans need to send out with their current contracts. There's not really an easy way to cobble together for the Pelicans, you know, something like $16 million without including Herb Jones, but then the Warriors can't take that back. So they can't even get Herb Jones in that sort of deal. Could you do Saddiq Bey, Jordan Hawkins, and Jose Alvarado? Yeah, you could do something like that, and that could work. I forget if Bey has, even though that deal's not done, you could expand that trade with the Wizards here. It gets really complicated really quickly, is what I'm trying to say here. And then when you factor in that the Pelicans are in the luxury tax, and if the goal is to get this deal done and stay below the luxury tax threshold, it gets even harder, right? You know, by my calculations, the Pelicans are $3.7 million below the tax. So if it's that, you know, $20 million per year example, and on the low end, it's $16 million outgoing for the Pelicans, you know, even if you do that and sign Kuminga for $20 million per year, you're in the luxury tax by $300K. And then, by the way, if you cross the luxury tax threshold in a sign and trade, it gets even harder to figure out because there are more restrictions. So all of that is to say this is doable but difficult, and almost certainly involves in some capacity Herb Jones leaving. More on that in the next segment here. And then you want to complicate it even further, right? $20 million probably isn't the amount that Jonathan Kuminga wants. I don't think he has a robust market, right? But if that's not what he wants, does this become feasible in the first place? And that's because a sign and trade needs to have at least 3 guaranteed years with no options. So you can't sign him to a 1-year, you know, a 2-year deal or a 3-year deal with a player option at the end of it. You know, it can't be 2 years and then a player option, or 1 year and a player option. It needs to be 3 fully guaranteed years. Then the 4th year could be a player option or team options, right? And also, I don't think the Pelicans want to trade Herb Jones. So that might make it a non-starter in the first place. You know, you could definitely see Jonathan Kuminga just signing a 1+1 with the full mid-level exception, basically $14.1 million to start. And that's just kind of be what it is, then a player option, you know, and go back to Golden State on something like that, or with another team too. And that could be New Orleans. And if it's $14 million, you know, it'd need to be a 3-year deal. That gets really tricky to pull this sort of thing off. So this deal, if it were to even be realistic or something the Pelicans would want to do, is really tough to try and figure out. But here's another question that I'm going to pose to you, and let's talk about this coming up. Does this even make sense for the Pelicans? On one hand, no. On the other hand, this is one of the most Joe Dumars signings that you can have, and I actually mean that in a positive way. I'll explain why that is. That's coming up here next in today's episode of Locked On Pelicans. Today's episode of Locked On Pelicans is brought to you by Monarch Money. You ever wish managing your money felt easier? With Monarch Money, it can. Whether you're growing your savings or planning for a big purchase, Monarch Money puts you in the driver's seat. It's like having your personal CFO giving you full visibility and control over your finances. And Monarch Money is more than just a budgeting app. It's a complete financial command center. So you can track all your accounts, investment, and spending in one place. So in addition to managing your money, you're also building wealth. I realized when I put all of my stuff into Monarch Money, all of my accounts, they make it really easy. You just click a couple buttons and it's all in there. I'm spending way too much on food delivery. Those fees really add up. So now I realize that, and I can budget smarter, save more money. You know, if you're trying to save to buy a home, just buy a car, just have some money aside for emergency purposes in a savings account, Monarch's going to help you achieve those goals, and you can show what your goals, what you want, and they're going to help you figure out how to accomplish it. So take control of your finances with Monarch Money. Use code LOCKEDONNBA at monarchmoney.com for 50% off your first year. That's monarchmoney.com, code LOCKEDONNBA for half off your first year. And thank you for making Locked On Pelicans your first listen today and every day. We're here Monday through Friday, the #1 Pelicans podcast, covering everything you want to know about this Pelicans team. So please subscribe wherever you get your podcasts and join over 11,000 Pelicans fans on YouTube as well. And become an everydayer. That means you listen Monday through Friday to the Locked On Pelicans podcast. And if you're an everydayer, let me know in the comments down below. And don't forget, watch us on the Gulf Coast Sports and Entertainment Network. For your second listen, Locked On Saints with Ross Jackson. The training camp schedule is out. Has Tyler Shough signed his contract yet? Ross Jackson's looking at all things black and gold, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Make him your second listen today. So does Jonathan Kuminga make sense for the Pelicans? I'm going to pause for dramatic effect. So there's two answers to this. On one hand, absolutely not. On the other hand, he's the most Joe Dumars type of signing. Look, this one's tough. This one's tough to figure out exactly who Jonathan Kuminga is as a player. He was very much miscast with the Golden State Warriors. You know, he's clashed at times with their head coach, Steve Kerr. He's also shown flashes of being a lead scorer in the NBA, but also gotten DMPs in playoff games. He doesn't shoot threes very well, doesn't even shoot his free throws particularly well, except in the playoffs when he kind of does. And he's a weird positional fit for New Orleans. He plays more power forward and at times small ball center. He's not a big long-term small ball center. Power forward is occupied by Zion Williamson and kind of Derek Queen here, and at times Trey Murphy. Where does Jonathan Kuminga fit in if you potentially have Herb Jones, Trey Murphy, and Kuminga kind of all on the wing? You're at a positional logjam where you already have a positional logjam. And do we know exactly who Kuminga is? Do you want to commit 20 to 25 million? It's probably going to be less for him, to a player that could be anything, right? Just because if he wasn't on the Golden State Warriors, we would be looking at him entirely differently, potentially, just because it was an odd fit there and they truthfully didn't develop him at all. So when I say all of that, right, it makes it seem like that's a terrible move for the Pelicans to make. But honestly, that's what makes him the perfect Joe Dumars kind of signing. The everydayers have heard me say this about Joe Dumars before. He is very opportunistic. When you look at how he built the 2004 Detroit Pistons that won the NBA title, defeated what seemed like a juggernaut in the Los Angeles Lakers, right? He did it through opportunistic means. You know, when you look at guys like Chauncey Billups and some of the other signings that he did, those were cast-offs from teams that had tons of potential to be extremely good and just needed to land in the right situation. I mean, that screams Jonathan Kuminga, doesn't it? He oozes potential. This dude is an athlete. Gets downhill, attacks, again, puts pressure on a defense as an advantage creator, and not regularly, but can. And that's what Joe Dumars is looking for. So if you have a chance to get a guy that you feel could be a massive difference maker for the team in that capacity, you go and get him, particularly if you can kind of get him on a cheaper contract because their market isn't there right now. So this represents that opportunistic move for Joe Dumars to make, or the moves that he's kind of made in the past. You want an aggressive team? An aggressive team is going to have Jordan Poole, Zion Williamson, and Jonathan Kuminga all on it, alongside Trey Murphy. Trey Murphy's not going to be included in any capacity in a Jonathan Kuminga deal. If you have friends telling you that, if you have people from other teams doing that, just point them to this show right now. That's not happening. I can tell you that's not happening. Herb Jones, probably not happening either, for the record. But Kuminga, with those guys, that is a lot of offensive creation and a lot of scoring. And Kuminga has shown that he can kind of do it in the playoffs too. While his, regular season numbers at times aren't particularly great, you look at him in the playoffs and the dude's shooting 40% from three, shooting 71. It gets better, per game from the free throw line in the playoffs. He stepped up there. When you look at him in the playoffs, against the Minnesota Timberwolves this year, right, in the Western Conference semifinals, second round of the playoffs, he was averaging 21 points per game on a Golden State Warriors team against a really good defense. Now, they lost that series 4-1, but he's shown that he can kind of do it a little bit, I think, here. And, that's great. He shot 42% on about 20 attempts in that playoff series. He oozes potential, right? He can rebound a little bit. This is someone who, can play, not point for you, but a little bit of point forward in a sense. Some of the advanced numbers look particularly good for him. For a wing player, he's a decent enough rebounder. He can assist and move the ball. His usage rate is somewhat high. That makes me worry about fit. Defensively, look, he's not an elite defender. He's not a Herb Jones level defender, but maybe in the right system, right team, he could be. If this is someone who wants to kind of be the number one guy, he's shown flashes of being able to do just that. And so if you can get those type of guys, maybe you should. And that's kind of why I think it could be a very Joe Dumars kind of move, even if I don't think the leaks are actually coming from the team. I think this is something that kind of fits the mold of what Joe Dumars has done before. He sees these opportunities and he jumps on them. Being aggressive with these kind of guys is definitely in his MO. And for a guy that is looking to have players that can attack a defense in multiple ways, not just shooting, whether that's good or bad, Kuminga really fits into that. But look, the team does need shooting. Kuminga is not what I would call a three-point threat, is not going to command a defense's attention in that capacity. That worries me a little bit, right? The fit of Zion, Poole, and Kuminga is a little wonky. There's not going to be much space. Now, all those guys don't necessarily need tons of space, particularly if you also throw Fears in there, who's really good at getting downhill and attacking too. All of that is an intriguing roster that I don't know if it's going to be good. And are you willing to give up Herb Jones for that sort of thing? And I'm not, that one's tough. Herb Jones is a fan favorite. It's one of my favorite players on the team, if not my favorite player on the team. And when you look at this team and the lack of defense, you kind of need the Herb Joneses of the world on the team. And Herb Jones is on a great contract. And for a team that is skirting around the luxury tax, you kind of need guys on good, cheap contracts. And so to me, it makes me a little bit wary of going after Jonathan Kuminga and what it would kind of do to the roster, particularly because having a wonky roster to start the year, you know what? That's fine if you're like, well, we'll be competing. Okay, it doesn't work out. Let's start developing the young guys and we'll lose games and we'll have a good draft pick. But you don't have a good draft pick next year. And look, yeah, you got Queen and you're kind of calling him your draft pick next year, but you gave up a lot to get Queen. That's not an ideal situation. And you don't want to have just kind of a wasted year in terms of win-loss. Even if you develop the young guys, you still got other things you need to accomplish too. And that's why the Pelicans have put themselves in a weird kind of two timeline spot. And I don't love that sort of thing, even if I love some of the guys, the guys that they drafted. So how does Kuminga fit that? Does that help you in the future long term? I'm not entirely sure. And Kuminga, look, could outperform a $20 to $25 million per year contract easily could do that. But also could not live up to that because we don't actually know who he is. I don't feel good enough about him as a player, having watched a bunch of him, talked to people about him, to really get an idea of what to expect from him next season, even in a different role on a different team. Yeah, there's potential it could go great, but there's potential that it wouldn't, and he's now not living up to that contract. So your range, your outcomes have such a range that it makes me a little bit nervous to do something like that. But, that's me kind of talking in a risk-adverse way. Joe Dumars is not risk-adverse, is he? It's about as aggressive as they get. That's what makes this so really interesting, I think. And we're going to end up seeing what happens. I keep checking my phone just to make sure I'm not missing an alert or something as I'm recording this show. So coming up next, more James Borrego news. That's what's kind of interesting here. Let's talk about that. That's coming up here next in today's episode of Locked On Pelicans. And thank you for making Locked On Pelicans your first listen today and every day. We are here Monday through Friday, the #1 Pelicans podcast covering everything you want to know about this Pelicans team. So please subscribe wherever you get your podcasts and join over 11,000 Pelicans fans on YouTube as well. And watch us on the Gulf Coast Sports and Entertainment Network every Monday through Friday at 10:30 a.m. By the way, you see the Pelicans tweeting that out from their official account? That was pretty cool. For your second listen, Locked On NBA. There's no off season in the NBA here. So Locked On NBA, where there's no off season, Doug, Matt, and Hayes keep you up to date on contract negotiations, rumors, and everything you need to be the most informed NBA fan. Find Locked On NBA on YouTube or wherever you listen to your podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So let me know what you think about Jonathan Kuminga down below. Again, I will stress that, I wonder if these rumors are just coming from the Golden State Warriors or something to try and drive up interest in him, because if there's more interest, then they're going to get more in return in a signing trade rather than very little if there's no interest. That could be where this is coming from. Could be his agents too. The Pelicans have not really leaked things. That Jordan Poole, CJ McCollum trade was not leaked at all. The Derek Queen stuff kind of leaked a little bit more, just kind of understanding their scouting process, but I don't think we had an idea it was going to be like that big of a trade or something like that. So it's interesting to kind of see that they've kept things quiet. When he was with the Detroit Pistons, Dumars got fined like $500,000, $750,000 for leaking NBA news. And I wonder if he kind of learned his lesson on that sort of thing, so doesn't leak much anymore because of that. Could be how he's operating here. Let's switch gears and just give you another coaching update, because I found this one kind of interesting. It sounds like the Sacramento Kings are zeroing in on Mike Brown to be their next head coach. And Shams of ESPN kind of tweeted out like that's what's going to happen. They kind of backdoored themselves into a good head coach, which, okay, whatever, good for them. And then it was, okay, Mark Stein saying, we talked about this in yesterday's show, the Everydayers kind of heard this, that maybe they want to hire James Borrego to be their lead assistant. But I don't know if that's going to happen anymore. The Pelicans seem pretty intent, from me talking to people around the team and from other reporting, that they want to keep James Borrego. And I think this is good. And I want to get into something with him specifically here in a second as we start to wrap up the show. It sounds like, according to Mark Stein, that the Denver Nuggets requested to interview or hire even just Borrego to be the lead assistant under David Adelman, their new head coach. And the Pelicans said no, because it's considered a lateral move. If they said no to the Denver Nuggets, you would imagine they're going to say no to the New York Knicks if they try and hire James Borrego to a lateral move, meaning they want to keep him. A lot of people are mixed on James Borrego, if he's good or not. Is he actually the offensive guy to run the team? Because look, the offense wasn't great the past 2 years. It's been really weird, I think. A lot of that, and I don't want this to sound like I'm like trashing Brandon Ingram or anything, but look, a big part of the offense was they installed this offense. Brandon Ingram didn't want to run said offense, and kind of it all went out the window because one of your main guys was like, no, that's not how I'm going to play. Like, that was a big part of them wanting to move on and kind of his time ending here in New Orleans. So if you actually let Borrego run the offense and have players that are buying into, let's call it Borrego ball, that could be a really big difference maker for the Pelicans. So when you look at their offense the past couple of years and it's like, well, what has Borrego done? Why are you fighting so hard to keep him? It just hasn't, the situation, the circumstances haven't led it to being kind of what you want. And so for that reason, if you get everyone kind of buying in, and it's going to take Zion buying in too, because it's going to be more Zion off ball. And if you go back 2 years ago, it was like, yeah, that didn't quite work. If you let Borrego just kind of run his offense and everyone buys in, Zion being ball dominant, but maybe working off ball a little bit more and adding everyone in, like there's enough offensive talent here to create a really scary offense, even with a lack of shooting. I'm not saying it'll actually be that and work out that way, but there's potential for that. And I think that's kind of fun and very exciting when it comes to this Pelicans team. I'd like to give Borrego one more year of figuring out what he could do with this team. You're going to need a really bright offensive mind and someone who's kind of focused solely on that to put all of these pieces together in a way that comes together as greater than the sum of its parts, right? And can be a pretty scary and potent offense, because New Orleans is a very different team than they were a year ago. And one of the things we've also seen from them is no matter what collection of players they have, there haven't been elite defenders on the team other than Herb Jones. But they've managed, in back-to-back seasons, have the 6th, 7th best defense in back-to-back years before the wheels fell off last year just due to all the injuries. CJ wasn't a defensive guy. Zion's not a defensive guy. Ingram's not a defensive guy, right? Those are your leading minutes guys. Valanciunas wasn't a defensive guy. Trey's not a defensive guy. And you were able to build a really, really good defense. And the everydayers, the long-time everydayers, if you're one of those, let me know, have heard me say this, right? Offense and defense are very connected. When you're putting the ball into the hoop and scoring, your defense can get back and get set and teams aren't running against you. One of the worst things you can do is blow layups because teams immediately have a fast break if that's the case. So if you get a really good offense and score, your defense gets better. Your defense gets better, right? Good defense leads to easy offense in transition opportunities. You block shots, you grab steals, you can run in transition, which is the easiest offense you can get. But good offense makes defense easier. And that's an important thing to keep in mind too. And then they start feeding off of one another. So you can be an elite defensive team, but if you don't have the offense, that defense is actually going to be held back a little bit too. It could be even more elite. So that's why this is exciting, that if you can build a really scary creative offense, and they have the tools and pieces to be a scary creative offense, I'm curious what they'd be able to accomplish and what this team could be. This is why I'm not as down on that Derek Queen trade as some others, or as worried about some of the lack of shooting, even though I agree they need to add some to it, because there's so many other pieces here that can, in Joe Dumars' words, compromise a defense, that it could be. It's a big risk. It might not work out, but there's potential here for them to be like something we really haven't seen before, and I kind of love that idea. Let me know what you think in the comments down below on YouTube. So that's going to do it for this episode of Locked On Pelicans. Let me know what you think about Jonathan Kuminga. As always, I'm your host, Jake Madison, at NOLA Jake on Twitter. This is the Locked On Pelicans podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I appreciate y'all listening, and I'll be back with y'all tomorrow.